May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our strength and our salvation. Amen. Please be seated. In our reading from Numbers 21 this morning, we heard one of the many complaints that the Israelites levy against Moses and against God during their long journey to the Promised Land. Numbers tells us that the Israelites became impatient along the way. The people spoke against God and against Moses. "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we detest this miserable food." Likewise, earlier in the book of Numbers, way back in chapter 11, right after God had given them manna, they complained even more bitterly. Numbers recounts. The rabble among the people had a strong craving, and the Israelites wept again and said, "If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at." To our ears, these passages might make the Israelites sound a bit entitled. God was taking care of them during their journey through the wilderness, but God's provision just wasn't good enough for them. They wanted more, and they wanted better. Manna just didn't cut it. Moses was certainly frustrated with the people's complaining. As the people's revolt against their diet of manna unfolded, Numbers recalls, Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families at the entrances of their tents. Then the Lord became very angry, and Moses was displeased. So Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you treated your servant so badly? Why have I not found favor in your sight, that you lay the burden of this people on me? Did I conceive this people? Did I give birth to them, that you should say to me, 'Carry them in your bosom as a wet nurse carries a nursing child, to the land you promised on oath to their ancestors?' Where am I to get meat to give to the people? For they come weeping to me, saying, 'Give us meat to eat.' I am not able to carry this people alone, for they are too heavy for me. If this is the way you are going to treat me, God, put me to death at once, if I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my misery." Moses is really suffering, really miserable. But isn't he being a little melodramatic, a little histrionic? The truth is, as much as we might look down on the Israelites for their whining about having to subsist on manna, few of us tend to relish having our lives uprooted, as the Israelites did when they left Egypt. Indeed, when we feel uprooted, we tend to yearn for whatever it is we've left behind, even if what we've left behind wasn't really all that great, wasn't really worth missing. Indeed, it seems difficult to imagine how the Israelites could possibly yearn to return to Egypt, where they had been enslaved. But their days had been more predictable, and their meals certainly were more filling. Now their lives were filled with uncertainty. They don't even know in advance on which days they will have to travel and on which days they'll be staying in place. Numbers tells us how the Israelites' daily schedule unfolds. On the day that the tabernacle was set up, a cloud covered the tabernacle all day long, and then from evening until morning it had the appearance of fire. It was always so. The cloud covered it by day, and the appearance of fire by night. Whenever the cloud lifted from over the tent, then the Israelites would set out, and in the place where the cloud settled down, there the Israelites would camp. So the Israelites were both provided for by God and also at the mercy of God. They had to learn to trust God for everything: their daily bread, their daily itinerary, their protection from enemies, and more. But even with God's protection, the Israelites' journey was still marked by trauma. Chapter 20, for instance, begins with the death of Miriam, the older sister of Moses and Aaron. Little detail is offered about Miriam's death, and the narrative simply moves forward, leaving both her story and her body behind. Tellingly, however, the very next episode features the Israelites complaining. Perhaps their complaining was a way to deal with trauma, particularly with feelings of being neglected by God. Let us recall this particular complaint from chapter 20. Now there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and against Aaron. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Would that we had died when our kindred died before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to bring us to this wretched place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." Then Moses and Aaron went away from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting. They fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and your brother Aaron, and command the rock before their eyes to yield its water." Moses and Aaron did succeed in drawing water from the rock, but rather than doing so by invoking God's power, they instead invoked their own. Moses said, "Listen, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" We? Water comes forth for the people. But God then imposes a severe consequence on Moses and Aaron, declaring, "Because you did not trust in me to show my holiness before the eyes of the Israelites, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." Seems awfully harsh, doesn't it? Moses and Aaron have led the people all this way, trusting God to the best of their ability, and now they won't be permitted to enter the promised land. Maybe God doesn't really mean it. We hope God doesn't really mean it. But then God begins to follow through. By the end of the chapter, telling Moses, "Take Aaron and his son Eleazar and bring them up Mount Hor. Strip Aaron of his vestments and put them on his son Eleazar." And shockingly, immediately after being divested, Aaron dies. Miriam has just died. Now Aaron is dead. Another trauma, more loss. Everything then stops while the people mourn Aaron's death for 30 days. Once the 30 days are up, however, is it any surprise that the Israelites begin to complain once again? That complaint is the one we heard in this morning's lesson. And of course they're complaining. They are not on a pleasure cruise. They are traveling across difficult terrain through territories ruled by other nations. They have experienced violence and they have inflicted violence. And now both Miriam and Aaron are dead. Only Moses remains to lead them. And shockingly, Moses won't be entering the promised land either. All of this makes the people more and more anxious. So much has already been taken from them, and they are fearful about the losses that are still to come. But rather than rail against God for how God is treating them, they complain about food, which is so incredibly human. It's a bit awkward to witness our forebears in faith whinging about their rations. Why couldn't they be stronger and more resilient? But also, why was God being so capricious, particularly toward Moses and Aaron? Do they really deserve to be denied entry into the promised land just for summoning water themselves rather than calling upon God to bring forth the water? Perhaps it seems so unfair because the history of interpretation has misidentified the reason for this consequence. One interpreter suggests that the more salient issue is that Moses and Aaron have not stood up to the people on God's behalf when the people start complaining. In multiple instances throughout the book of Numbers, rather than stand up to the people, we are told that Aaron and Moses fall on their faces. It's a dramatic action. In the face of people's criticism, Aaron and Moses do not speak, but rather they fall prostrate. And are they prostrating themselves in prayer, seeking God's guidance and assistance, or are they prostrating themselves to avoid engaging with the people's complaints? God seems to make the latter interpretation, perceiving their habit of falling on their faces as cowardly leadership, which makes far more sense as a reason to demote these otherwise venerable leaders. But still, it's difficult. So what should be our takeaway from reading Numbers in the midst of our own Lenten journey? Perhaps most of all, I take away a sense of how deeply human and fundamentally flawed even the most venerable biblical characters really were. They are so much like us. They are us. Even Moses could be cowardly. Indeed, the continuous complaints of the Israelites ultimately wore Moses down. He could no longer face the relentlessness of their discontent, so he took to falling on his face rather than standing up and talking back to them. Moses wasn't felled by enemy forces, but by his own people's frustrations with him and with God. I think it's important for us to remember that as human as it is to complain, our complaints really do impact others. So often others are trying their very best, and our complaints, even when couched as feedback, can be so demoralizing. In addition, I think it's worth exploring whenever we are full of complaint or criticism, what else is going on in our psyches? Is something else bothering us or troubling us? In Numbers, the traumatizing deaths of Miriam and Aaron certainly seem connected to the people launching into their litanies of complaint. And so often it is easier to complain about mundane things than to grieve the bigger and harder losses in our lives. So it behooves us to explore our own consciousness when we notice that we are doing a lot of complaining. Which is not to say that all complaining is unwarranted. But we live in a particularly privileged sector of American society where we seem to presume, even expect, that things should generally go our way. Being part of a community, however, teaches us that whenever we want something to be a certain way, someone else probably wants the exact opposite. So it can be helpful to hold our opinions and preferences loosely, knowing that life in community, just like life in a family, requires a great deal of give and take and compromise. As you go forth into the remainder of Lent, then, may you be attentive to your speech, how it serves to build others up and how it serves to tear others down. And may God give us the grace, when we need it, to speak hard truths that need to be said, but to speak them with a superabundance of love and grace. May it be so.